$6.
Every man on that pier turned around at once.
Son, that's 32 feet of dead boat. Engine hasn't turned over in 3 years. You even know what you're bidding on?
A boat nobody else wants, $6.
16 years old, duffel bag on one shoulder, the only black face standing under those harbor lights, and every grown man there had already decided exactly what he was. A kid playing at something, a kid who'd be gone by Sunday. Going once, going twice. The clipboard came down against his palm like a gavel. Sold to the boy. What none of them knew was that the cabin of that boat had been padlocked shut for 3 years, and bolted under the floorboards, right beside that dead engine, somebody had left something behind. Something that was about to cost this harbor everything it thought it remembered about itself. If you believe old and finished aren't the same word, hit like and subscribe before we start. 40 seconds before that clipboard came down, nobody on that pier had wanted the thing at all. It was the last Thursday in January. Thistle Cove, Maine had turned out about 20 people for a marine lien sale under a string of bare bulbs at the end of the town pier. Boatyard men in canvas coveralls, 2 contractors eyeing a stack of lumber, one guy in a good wool coat who kept checking his watch. The harbor master ran it himself. Kurt Bellamy had done this often enough that he read the lots the way a man reads a grocery list. A trailer went in 90 seconds. A stack of traps went to a nod. Then Bellamy flipped a page and squinted at the last line. Lot 4, 1978 Down East hull, 32 feet. Cabins padlocked. Previous owner Wendell Pike, deceased. Unpaid dockage going back the better part of 3 years. He let that sit, then added the part that mattered. Sold as is. Buyers got 60 days to move it or the harbor scraps it. Somebody in the back laughed into his collar. That's not a boat, Kurt. That's a mooring anchor with a wheelhouse. Nobody bid. Bellamy asked for an opening number the way you ask a room if anybody's seen your keys. Out of habit, not hope. He scanned the crowd, wrote something down, and started to move on. And a hand went up near the back. Not high, just up. His name was Ezekiel Landry. Anybody who'd known him a week called him Zeke. He'd grown up 2 hours inland, in a town small enough that people knew whose truck belonged to whom. His father, Terrence Landry, ran line maintenance at a particle board plant outside Skowhegan, the man they called when a press seized at 2 in the morning. Then the plant closed. Not slowly, not with warning, a letter taped to the break room door. A foreman who couldn't look anybody in the eye, and a parking lot that emptied out for the last time on a Friday in November. Terrence took a settlement check that barely covered what was owed on the house. 4 months later, he was gone. Not dead. Just gone. The way some men go when watching your kid go without gets heavier than staying. Zeke told himself he didn't blame him. Most days that even held. But here's the part everybody in Thistle Cove would get wrong for the next several months. It's also the part that explains that raised hand. Terrence Landry had put a wrench in his son's hand at 9 years old, not as a lesson, as free labor. Zeke spent half his childhood on a creeper under somebody's Buick in the driveway, passing sockets up into the dark and getting yelled at when he passed up the wrong one. By 14, he could tell you a car's charging system was failing just by how the headlights dimmed at idle. And after the plant closed, when there was no work anywhere for a kid with no license and no car, he found a junkyard out on Route 2 that paid $5 a day, cash, to anybody willing to climb into a wrecked car in February and come out holding the alternator. He did that for 2 winters. So no, he didn't know how to be a son without a father. But he knew exactly how to be the guy who fixes the thing nobody else will touch. She folding table by the shed had a cash box, a stack of carbon copy bill of sale forms, and a pen on a string. Zeke put $6 down in ones. 3 of them were soft as cloth. Bellamy counted them anyway out of habit or respect and slid the form across. How old are you, son? 16. Bellamy set the pen down and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He explained it flat without unkindness. A lien sale is a legal transfer. The facility gets to sell a boat to cover what's owed once the notices go out. But a contract signed by a 16-year-old is a contract a 16-year-old can walk away from, and no harbor is putting a vessel on the books that way.
Which means I need an adult of record on that line with you, Bellamy said.
Or we scrap her Tuesday. That should have been the end of it. A boy, $6, and a rule. Then a man stepped out of the dark at the edge of the bulbs and put his hand out for the pen. He was past 60, built like a fence post, with hands that looked carved instead of grown. Roy Marrow had run a machine shop in that town for 31 years and sold it in 2016 to a man from Portland who turned it into a kayak rental. These days, Roy worked out of a toolbox and the bed of a Ford. He signed without reading it. "Don't thank me." He capped the pen and was already walking off when he said the rest.
I just don't feel like watching a kid drown in 6 feet of harbor over paperwork.
That was how Zeke Landry came to own a boat. Not a home, not a plan. A locked, rusted-out lobster boat in a slip nobody wanted, with a deadline already running and new fees starting the second he signed his name. The name was stenciled along the stern in flaking white paint. Norabel. Zeke walked the length of her and read her the way you read a car in a junkyard lot. Not for what she looks like, but for what she's been through. Rust bleeding down from a deck fitting, which meant water had been sitting where water shouldn't sit. A wheelhouse window cracked and patched with duct tape gone gray, which meant somebody had stopped caring around year 1. A chain wrapped twice around the cabin doors and a padlock the color of dried blood. And under all of it, when he laid his palm flat against the hull, cold steel that didn't give. Roy came down the dock with a pair of bolt cutters hanging off his belt. "You know what you just bought? A boat. You bought a problem with a mattress in it." He set the jaws against the shackle and asked, without looking up, whether Zeke wanted it open or not. Zeke nodded. Roy bore down. The metal gave with a crack too loud for a quiet dock, and the chain slid free and hit the deck with a sound like a dropped anchor. He didn't clean anything that first night. The cabin was dry and dark and small, with a narrow bunk built into the hull, and a wool blanket somebody had folded and left there years ago like they meant to come back for it. Zeke lay down in his jacket, listened to the water knock against steel 8 inches from his ear, and slept harder than he had since November. Here's what a normal person does the next morning. They sweep. Zeke Landry did not sweep. The first thing he did before he ate anything was find the engine cover, a hinged panel under the wheelhouse floor seized with corrosion that took 10 minutes and a length of scrap pipe to convince. When it finally came up, the smell came with it. Old diesel, salt, something sweeter underneath that turned out to be 3 years of standing water. And there she was. A 4-cylinder marine diesel, roughly the size of a chest freezer, wearing a coat of grease that had dried into something closer to wax. Zeke sat down on the edge of the opening with his feet hanging into the engine bay and did the only thing he actually knew how to do. He started cleaning it. Not to make it pretty, to make it readable. Rag, solvent, thumbnail. He worked the black off the top of the block in patches, the way you'd clear frost off a windshield, until the builder's plate came up out of it with a model number and a date stamped into the metal. The engine was older than his father. Then he went looking for the story, and the story was bad. Belts cracked through, one of them snapped and lying coiled in the bilge like something dead. Hoses hard as plumbing pipe. Battery terminals furred green. All of that was hours, and hours he had. So he charged 2 batteries off 100 feet of borrowed extension cord, waited until mid-afternoon, and pushed the start button. Clack. One sound. Flat. Nothing turned. A weak battery gives you a groan, a drag, the sound of a machine trying and failing. That flat click meant the starter itself hadn't moved in so long it had welded itself shut with salt, which told him something he didn't like. The Norabel hadn't wound down slowly. Something had stopped her. And then somebody had padlocked the door and walked away from her for 3 years. 2 days later, he was chasing water. There was an inch in the bilge that shouldn't have been there, and the strainer that keeps mud out of the cooling system sat under the cabin floor, behind a run of boards that had to come up. Zeke pulled them one at a time. Most lifted with a screwdriver and a bad word. The fourth one didn't. Same width as the others. Same wood. But screwed down. 8 stainless screws, driven flush, not a spot of rust on a single head. And when he finally backed them out and got his fingers under the edge, there was a strip of rubber gasket running the full length of the board. Nobody gaskets a floorboard. You gasket a lid. The space underneath was deeper than it had any business being on a boat that size, and dry as a drawer. Sitting in the middle of it, wrapped in a tarp that had held out 3 main winters, was a wooden crate. Zeke carried it up on deck to open it in daylight. He'd like to tell you his hands shook. They didn't. He'd opened enough boxes in enough junkyards to know that most of them are full of somebody's disappointment. What was in this one was 4 hardcover notebooks, oil-blacked at the corners, with thumbprints in the margins. A stack of letters tied with kitchen twine. Receipts for injectors, for a rebuilt water pump, for plywood, for a dozen sleeping bags bought all at once from a surplus store up in Rockland. And diagrams, hand-drawn, in pencil, on graph paper gone soft at the folds. A fuel system laid out valve by valve. A wiring schematic with every circuit labeled in block capitals. An exploded view of a starter motor, every piece pulled apart on the page and numbered, and beside it, in a small, careful hand, brushes wear first.
Check these before you buy anything.
Zeke sat back on his heels with the rag still in his fist. It wasn't treasure. It was a manual, written by a dead man, for whoever came next. In the bottom of the crate, there was a leather folder gone soft with age, and inside it, 1 sheet of paper. He read it 4 times. For anyone who gets to this harbor with nothing, there's a bunk, there's coffee, there's a full set of tools if you need them. Pay it back if you can. If you can't, pass it on to the next one. Signed with 2 letters, WP. Zeke opened one of the notebooks. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger. First names, dates, small numbers. 20 here, 40 there. 110 once in 2009, with a part number written beside it. Some entries were crossed out with a single word. Paid. Most of them weren't. Most had a different word beside them, pressed into the paper hard enough to nearly tear through. Forgiven. He counted 41 of those in the first notebook alone. And there was one more thing in that folder at the very back that he didn't understand for another 5 months. A blank state incorporation form, half filled out, dated 2004. Never signed. Never sent. Zeke closed the crate. He climbed back down into the engine bay, and he started taking the starter motor off. My matter of fact, word moves through a harbor town faster than weather. It wasn't 3 days before somebody came down to look at him. The man was gray-bearded and built like a fire hydrant, and he stopped at the stern the way people stop at a grave, a step short, hands in his pockets. Heard a kid bought Wendell's boat. That'd be me. He said his name was Boyd Larkin, 41 years fishing out of Thistle Cove, and then he stood there a while looking at the rust streak under the deck fitting like it was personally disappointing him. Zeke went below and came back up with one of the letters. He'd read it twice the night before. It thanked Wendell Pike for $40 and a place to sleep, and it ended with a line about still thinking of that winter every time the writer went out. Boyd's face changed the second he recognized his own handwriting. He never told anybody what he did. Boyd folded the letter back along its old creases, careful, like it might come apart on him. You'd hear things. Somebody got an injector pump rebuilt and never saw a bill. But he never made a show of it. Man passed 3 years back, and half this harbor didn't come to the service. because half this harbor never knew what they owed him. And then Boyd told him the thing that reorganized the whole story in Zeke's head. Wendell Pike wasn't a fisherman. Wendell Pike was a mechanic. 30 years of marine repair out of a shop that went under in the 90s and never got rebuilt. After that, he worked off the boat. Engines, wiring, cooling systems, whatever came down the dock. And he charged what a man could pay, which in Thistle Cove in February was frequently nothing. The bunk and the coffee were never the point. They were what you did while the engine was apart. The starter came off in 40 minutes and weighed more than it looked like it should. Zeke took it apart on the cooler lid in order, setting each piece down left to right the way his father had made him do it so nothing got guessed at. The diagnosis took under 5 minutes because Wendell Pike had already written it down. Brushes worn past the spring. The copper drum they ride on scored black, and the rear bushing so packed with salt the whole thing wouldn't turn by hand. That drum had to be cut true again on a lathe, 1/1000th of an inch at a time. Zeke did not own a lathe. Zeke owned $6 worth of boat, but there was a shop 40 minutes up the road with a sign out front that said, Stannard Machine and Marine, and he'd walked past it twice. The place smelled like cutting oil and floor wax. The floor was swept. There was a bell on the door that worked. Ed Stannard came out from the back wiping his hands, took one look at the kid in the thin jacket holding a starter armature wrapped in a shop rag, and stopped 4 feet short of his own counter. You got an account here? No, sir. You got money? Zeke shifted the part to his other hand. I've got a commutator that needs turning and about 10 minutes of your time. I'll sweep the shop for it. Ed didn't look at the part, not once. Then you've got no business behind my counter, son. That equipment costs more than your whole situation. Zeke stood there about 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, he did what he always did, which was look past the man at the room. Rooms tell you things. There was a framed certificate on the wall behind the register. Gold seal, glass, dusted. Licensed marine surveyor. Zeke said thank you because his mother had raised him and his father hadn't managed to unraise him, and he walked back out under the bell. He'd heard that tone before, in a school office in November, in a gas station on Route 1 where a man had followed him down 2 aisles. It was never the words. It was the speed of the decision, the way the answer arrived before the question finished landing. So he went to the junkyard instead. Not a marine yard, a car yard 11 miles up the coast that sold parts by the pound and didn't ask anybody's age. Zeke biked out on a rusted mountain bike Roy loaned him and went through a shelf of dead starters in the cold until he found 2 of the same series as his. Both of them junk. One with a burned field coil and a perfect commutator. The other the exact opposite. $12 for the pair. He built one working starter out of 2 dead ones on the cooler lid of a boat he'd bought for $6. When he bench tested it off the batteries, it spun so hard it walked itself sideways across the wheelhouse floor, and he had to catch it before it went in the water. 2 things nobody wanted, bolted together into one thing that worked. He didn't say that out loud to anybody. He wouldn't have known how. Roy Merrow started coming down most evenings after that, and he made his terms clear the first night. He sat on an overturned bait crate with a thermos between his boots and watched. About 20 minutes in, when Zeke was fighting a fitting in a spot his hand didn't fit, Roy said it. I don't put my hands on your boat. Zeke looked up with his knuckles bleeding. Not once. Not ever. You want somebody to fix it for you? There's yards up the coast'll take your money. But I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you when you're wrong. That turned out to be worth more than a set of hands, because Roy talked the way good mechanics teach, by refusing to answer the question you actually asked. Don't chase the noise. Chase the sequence. He said it about twice a week for 2 months. Air, fuel, compression. It's a diesel, so there's no spark to worry about. 2 doors, not 3. Now which one are you standing at? And Zeke would have to say it out loud. Half the time, saying it out loud was the answer. There was one other thing Roy did, and he did it in a way that closed the conversation before it opened. Batteries alone were $200. filters, oil, coolant, belts, hose, clamps. Call it 400 more if he shopped like a miser, which he did. Zeke had $31 and a shift and a half a week sweeping Bellamy's shed. One evening, Roy put $200 on the engine cover, under a wrench so the wind wouldn't take it. "I can't take that. It's not a gift." Roy screwed the cap back on his thermos and stood up like his knees had opinions about it. "It's Pike's rules. Pay it back if you can. If you can't, you already know the rest. You've been reading it every night for a month." Zeke got a boatyard job 3 weeks later. 12 hours a week, sanding and hauling, cash on Fridays. He paid Roy back by the end of that summer, and Roy made him write it in the ledger and cross it out with the right word. The fuel nearly ended the whole thing in February. Diesel doesn't go bad the way gasoline does. It goes biological. Water condenses in a half-empty tank, and where fresh water meets fuel, things grow. When Zeke put a light down into that tank, what came back wasn't fuel. It was the color and thickness of cold black tea with mats of gray-green sludge floating in it like something drowned. 90 gallons of it. He siphoned it out into jerry cans over 3 days, in shifts, in a wind that never stopped, because he had one length of hose and 2 cans. He scrubbed the tank with a rag on a wire. He replaced 11 feet of line that crumbled when he touched it. And then he found the crack in the lift pump, the small mechanical pump that pulls fuel up to the engine, and he sat down on the cabin floor and did the math. $140 new, 90 rebuilt if he could find one. That night he went back to the notebooks, and on a page dated 11 years earlier, in that same careful hand, there was a part number that matched the casting in his lap. Beside it, a note. Ordered 2. Vachon only needed the 1. Spares in the forward locker, wrapped. Zeke crawled forward past the bunk into a locker he'd never fully emptied and dug down through coiled line and mildew to the bottom. There it was, a lift pump in waxed paper, the tape gone yellow, 11 years old and never opened. And lying flat underneath it against the hull, a canvas tool roll, worn soft as cloth, tied with a leather thong. Zeke unrolled it on his knees in the dark. Wrenches, feeler gauges, a brass hammer with the handle worn into somebody else's grip. And on the flap, punched into the canvas with a leather tool, 2 letters. W.P. Memarch was the grind nobody makes a video about. Wiring, mostly. The loom was original. The insulation had gone chalky, and Zeke rebuilt the entire engine circuit off Wendell's schematic, which turned out to be more accurate than the factory diagram he found at the library. He labeled every run with tape and a marker. Then the alternator, which was dead. There was no marine unit he could afford, so he found an automotive one at the junkyard for $18 with the right output and the wrong everything else. The pulley he swapped. The mounting foot he couldn't. He needed a bracket cut out of 1/4-inch plate and welded into an L, dead square, because a belt running a 1/16 of an inch out of line will scream, then smoke, then throw itself into the bilge. Welding was the one thing on that entire boat he couldn't do with his hands and a borrowed drill. He'd known that for 2 days and hadn't said it to anybody, because saying it meant walking back up that road and standing on the wrong side of that counter. He didn't have to. Ed Stannard came down the dock on a Saturday and stood at the head of slip 14 a while without announcing himself. Word had gotten around the shop the way word does. A rebuilt starter out of 2 dead ones. A tank pulled and scrubbed by hand. He picked up the bracket Zeke had mocked up out of angle iron and hose clamps and sighted down the pulley plane with one eye shut, the way men of a certain age do. "That your work?" "Yes, sir." "It's close." He set it back down. There was a long exhale, and whatever happened inside Ed Stannard in those 4 seconds, he never once explained it to anybody. "Shop opens at 6. Side doors never locked. Don't make me regret it." He didn't apologize. Men on that dock didn't apologize with words, they apologized with keys. There was one more thing that spring, and it took about 9 seconds. Zeke was at the fuel dock filling cans when a man he'd never seen before came over, friendly enough, and asked whose boat he was working on down there. Mine. The man laughed. Not meanly. He laughed the way you laugh when a kid tells you he's a pilot. No, I mean, who owns her? Who's the owner? Zeke told him again. The man nodded slowly, said, "Huh," and walked off unconvinced. Zeke went back to filling cans. He'd stopped explaining himself somewhere around week 3. It cost less to just keep working. Ray Vachon came down that same week with a truck bed full of reclaimed cedar and didn't ask for anything except coffee and somewhere to sit. Zeke recognized the name before the man finished saying it because he'd read it in a notebook in February. "You're in the ledger, 2009, $110 and a part number next to it." Ray went very still with a plank half off the truck. "That'd be a lift pump. That'd be the winter my wife left and took the house, and I slept in that cabin right there for 6 weeks." He got the plank down and stood it against the rail. When he spoke again, there was something under it that wasn't gratitude. "You want to know the truth of it? We let him do that for 30 years, and not one of us ever asked him how he was making rent. He fixed half the boats in this harbor, and when he died, there wasn't enough in his name to bury him properly. That's not a nice story, son. People tell it like it's a nice story." The engine came back to life for 9 seconds on the 9th of March. Everything was in. New filters, new lines, the rebuilt starter, the salvaged alternator, 90 gallons of clean diesel bought in $20 increments over 5 weeks. Zeke pushed the button, and it caught. It caught and it ran, rough and loud and shaking the whole hull, black smoke punching out of the exhaust. And Zeke stood there in the wheelhouse with both hands flat on the console and did not breathe. Then the temperature needle came off its peg and climbed like it had somewhere to be. He shut it down himself before it could cook. The raw water impeller, a rubber wheel the size of a hockey puck that pushes seawater through the cooling system, had gone hard as an old eraser after 3 years dry. It hadn't just failed, it had come apart, which meant every one of its veins was now jammed somewhere downstream in the exact system that was supposed to keep that engine from destroying itself. Zeke spent 2 days picking black rubber out of the tube stack with needle-nose pliers and a flashlight in his teeth, counting as he went because Roy told him to. 6 veins on that pump. You find 5, you're not done. You're just tired. He found 6. He put it all back together. He pushed the button again. And that time it never even fired. What followed was 5 weeks in which Zeke Landry could not make that engine run and could not find out why. It turned over. It had fuel. He'd cracked every fitting and watched clean diesel come out. It had air. The starter spun it fast and strong. Air, fuel, compression. 2 doors, not 3, which left the door nobody wants to open. Compression is the whole trick of a diesel. There's no spark. You squeeze the air until it's hot enough to light the fuel by itself. If the cylinders won't hold that squeeze, nothing you do outside the engine matters. And that 9-second run had told the truth about what killed her. Somebody had run that engine hot once, years ago. Hot enough to score the walls of 2 cylinders. Hot enough that she'd never made full compression again. Which is exactly why she'd been left at the dock with a padlock on the door instead of being sold. Zeke borrowed a compression gauge from Ed's shop and tested all 4. 2 of them were fine. 2 of them weren't close. He sat on the engine cover for a long time with the gauge in his hand, because now he knew what he was looking at. A bottom-end rebuild. Pistons out, cylinders honed, rings and bearings replaced. It's not exotic work. Any yard on that coast does it. Any yard on that coast would have charged him $4,000. Zeke had $160, 12 hours a week at the boatyard, and a removal deadline that Kurt Bellamy had already quietly extended twice. He stopped going down to the boat for 9 days. He worked his shifts, He slept in a room he was renting from Roy Merrow for $60 a month, payable Fridays, and Roy collected every one, because Roy was not running a charity and said so. Nobody pushed him. That's a thing about a harbor town in April. They watch you decide. On the 10th day, Roy Merrow came out to the garage where Zeke was sitting on an upturned bucket doing nothing and stood in the doorway with his thermos. "You want my opinion or you want to be left alone?" Zeke didn't answer for a while. "Say it. You're doing the arithmetic like a man who has to buy the parts." Roy came in and sat down on a milk crate across from him. "That engine's been in production since 1962. There are 3,000 of them rotting in yards between here and New Bedford. Pistons don't wear out. Cylinders wear out. You don't need $4,000, kid. You need a donor." And that's how Ezekiel Landry ended up spending 6 Saturdays in a marine salvage yard outside Rockland, in the rain, pulling apart a seized engine that would never run again to get 4 pistons that would. Ed Stannard honed the 2 bad cylinders on the shop's boring machine and charged the price of the stone. Zeke did every other part of it himself, in a hull, on his back, in a space too small to swing a wrench in, which is how he learned that a marine diesel is not designed to be rebuilt by one person, and that it can be done anyway if you're patient and stupid enough. It took him until the 2nd week of June. They didn't announce it, but there were 6 people on that dock the evening he tried again. Roy on his bait crate, Boyd Larkin with his hands in his pockets, Ray Vachon, Ed Stannard standing a little apart, having driven down from a shop he'd once thrown this kid out of, Kurt Bellamy off shift, pretending he was there for something else, and Margot Tilley, the head librarian, who had quietly stopped enforcing the rule about backpacks back in February and had never said a word about it to anybody. Zeke checked the oil, checked the coolant, opened the seacock, ran the blower. The whole sequence out loud the way Roy had made him do it 100 times. Then he pushed the button. It caught. It caught and it held. All 32 feet of her shaking with it, exhaust going black and then gray and then almost clear, the sound climbing and then settling down into something even and low and unbothered. The sound of a machine that had been dead for 3 years, remembering what it was for. Ray Vachon took his hat off, which he denied later. Boyd Larkin turned around and looked out at the water for a while. Ed Stannard said nothing at all and stayed another 40 minutes. And Roy Merrow, who had not put his hands on that boat one single time in 5 months, leaned forward on the bait crate and said the only thing he was going to say about it. Well, there she is. Nobody on that dock called him the kid again after that evening. They used his name. By July, there was a piece of scrap plywood wired to the rail, hand-lettered, that said, "Harbor Help. Ask inside." It started with a laid-off millwright named Lonnie Trask, who'd been sleeping in a Corolla behind the Baptist church for 11 days when somebody at the diner mentioned the boat. He slept in that bunk for 2 weeks, and Zeke, who had an engine that ran now and a shop key and a man's worth of skill in a 17-year-old's hands, did the thing that made all of this different from charity. He didn't just let Lonnie sleep. He taught him to change a raw water pump, start to finish, twice, until Lonnie could do it without being watched. 10 days later, Lonnie had a job at the boatyard, because when the foreman asked whether anybody in the room could handle a pump swap on a 30-footer by Thursday, exactly 1 man put his hand up. There was no organization. There was no paperwork. There was a bunk, a coffee pot, and a tool roll with 2 letters stamped in the flap. And that is exactly when a man in a good coat walked to the head of slip 14 with a roll of drawings under his arm. His name was Preston Vale. He represented a company called Coastal Vantage Development, which had bought the boatyard adjoining the town pier 18 months earlier and had plans for the rest of it. 1978 hull, corroded frames, an engine that's been rebuilt by, forgive me, an unlicensed miner with no service history anybody can verify. He said it pleasantly, the way you'd read a weather report. I'm not being cruel.
I'm being accurate.
It isn't worth what it costs to keep it floating. 6 weeks later, Preston Vale proved he wasn't only talking. Coastal Vantage bought the boatyard where Zeke worked in the last week of August. Not to shut it down, to fold it into the plan. New management, new payroll, a clean roster going into the fall. Zeke was let go on a Friday with the rest of the part-timers. Lonnie Trask kept his job. Nobody said one word about a boat. That's the thing people miss about power. It doesn't have to point at you. It just has to move. And you happen to be standing there. And in the same week, Coastal Vantage's council filed a written request with the town asking the harbor to enforce its own removal deadline on Lot 4 of the January lien sale, which was, unfortunately, entirely legitimate. That deadline was 60 days. It was now day 212. Kurt Bellamy had extended it 3 times on nothing but his own signature. He couldn't extend it a 4th time with a letter from a law firm in his file. The commission gave them a hearing date in October and one condition to meet before it. If the Norabel was going to stay at a public dock with people sleeping aboard, she needed a licensed survey and she needed insurance. Not sentiment, not a safety record, a policy in force with a number on it. Ed Stannard spent 2 days on that boat and charged the fund $6, which he never explained to anybody. He did it properly. Ultrasonic thickness readings on the plating, frame by frame. Compression on all 4 cylinders. Fuel, cooling, wiring, through hulls. The compression came back beautiful. All 4 within 8% of factory spec. The hull did not. There were 3 readings below minimum along the starboard side, low down, where the bilge water had been sitting for 3 years before Zeke ever laid eyes on her. Ed didn't soften it, and Zeke wouldn't have wanted him to. That's not a repair you do in the water. That's a haul out. Cut the bad plate out, weld new steel in. Yard rate on that is 3 weeks and about $9,000. And the insurer, reading the same report, declined to bind coverage. No policy, no lease, no boat. Preston Vale had not raised his voice 1 time. Zeke read that declination letter about 4 times, sitting on the engine cover of a boat that ran perfectly and could not legally stay where it was. And that was the night he finally went back to the crate for the thing he'd never understood. The blank incorporation form, half filled out, dated 2004. He brought it to Hal Quimby's kitchen table 2 towns up the coast. 81 years old, answered his own door, listened to the whole thing over black coffee without interrupting once. Quimby put on his glasses and looked at that form for a long time. I typed this. Wendell came to me in the spring of '04. He wanted to make the thing permanent, a foundation, a board, the works. He had it about 1/3 of the way built. He set it down and took his glasses back off. His wife died that August, Nora. He never came back to finish it. Not in 20 years. I called him twice and then I stopped calling. Zeke asked why not. Because a foundation is a thing you build for after you're gone, son. And I don't think that man could stand to think about after anymore. So he just kept doing it by hand, month to month, until he ran out of months. Zeke sat with that. Then he asked Hal Quimby how much it cost to finish a 22-year-old form. About $400 and a great deal of my afternoon. I'll waive the afternoon. The fire hall in Thistle Cove was standing room only on the 3rd Tuesday in October. Vale went first, and he was good. 20 minutes, no notes, revenue projections a person could actually follow. Then he did the only thing he really needed to do, which was hold up a single page. This is the insurer's declination, dated last month. I want to be clear that I take no pleasure in this. The young man's work is genuinely impressive, but an uninsurable vessel with 3 sub-minimum hull readings at a public dock with people sleeping aboard. That's not a debate about sentiment. That's a liability sitting on this town's balance sheet. And he was right. That was the worst part. He was completely right. Zeke walked to the podium with a cardboard box and a folder, and about 90 seconds into it, he understood that the speech he'd written was not going to work. Because his plan had been to argue that the boat was sound, and the boat was not sound. There was a piece of paper in that room, signed by the only man qualified to sign it, that said so. So he stopped, mid-sentence. And he did the thing he'd been trained to do all winter by a man who refused to touch his engine. He stopped chasing the noise, and he chased the sequence. He set the box down and started over. He's right. The room did something then, and it wasn't quiet. 3 readings below minimum, starboard side, down low. It's in the survey, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it isn't. But that's not a reason to scrap her. That's a work order. He took the second folder out of the box. Nobody sleeps aboard until it's fixed. That starts tonight. I'll move them to the church basement myself, and I've already spoken to the pastor. She gets hauled at Standards in November. Cut the bad plate, weld new steel, resurvey before she goes back in the water. That's 3 weeks and $9,000. I have $1,100. The rest is a 5-year note that the insurer will write against a resurvey because I asked them, and I have that in writing too. He put the last page down on the table. And the note isn't in my name, it's in the funds. Because Hal Quimby had filed a 22-year-old form 6 days earlier, and the state of Maine had granted a charter that afternoon to something called the Pike Harbor Fund. 3 directors, none of them Zeke, all of them over 60, and a trustee. One of the commissioners asked the question Vale hadn't gotten to. And when you're 20 and you get an offer somewhere warmer, who runs it then? Zeke had been waiting for that one all fall. You're describing a single point of failure, ma'am. You don't fix that with a person. You fix it with redundancy. Lonnie Trask can already run every system on that boat without me standing there. I taught him in 2 weeks. There'll be a 3rd one by spring and a 4th after that. That's not sentiment. That's how you keep a machine alive longer than the man who built it. Then he took one last thing out of the box and read a single line off it. A letter written in 2011 to a fisherman who'd needed $40 and a place to sleep. If nobody else remembers you're worth something, let this boat remember it for you. He folded it and put it away. You keep saying she isn't worth what it costs. Old doesn't mean useless. It means somebody stopped showing up. The commission didn't overturn the marina plan. That's not what happened, and this isn't that kind of story. Coastal Vantage got its 40 slips a quarter-mile down the shoreline, where the water's deeper anyway, and the restaurant opened the following spring. What the commission did was carve slip 14 out of the footprint and grant the Pike Harbor Fund a renewable municipal lease at a token rate. Conditional on the haul-out being completed by March, a clean resurvey, and a policy in force before one more person slept aboard. They gave him the hardest possible version of yes. The Norabel came out of the water on the 9th of November and went back in on the 2nd of March with 11 feet of new steel in her starboard side, and Zeke Landry welded 4 of those seams himself, badly at first, then not badly, under Ed Stannard's supervision and on Ed Stannard's clock. The resurvey passed, the policy bound, the lease executed on the 14th of March, which was, and nobody in that room mentioned it, 3 days after his 18th birthday. The following October, on a gray afternoon, a kid came down the dock. 16 maybe, thin jacket, wrong for the season, duffel bag over one shoulder. He stopped 4 feet short of the stern and stood there working up to it. They said down at the diner there's a guy here who lets people... He couldn't get to the end of the sentence. He looked at the dock instead. Zeke had spent 21 months on the other side of that exact silence, and he remembered precisely what it cost to stand in it. Bunk's second on the left. Coffee's on the burner and it's bad, so don't get excited. The boy said his name was Petey Godet and started to say something else. Zeke turned around and reached up onto the shelf above the workbench. He took down a canvas tool roll, worn soft, with 2 letters punched into the flap. And these are yours while you're here. Petey took it with both hands like it might be a trick. What do I owe you? Zeke thought about a padlock the color of dried blood, about 4 notebooks with 206 entries and one word written over and over, pressed into the paper hard enough to nearly tear through. Pay it back if you can. If you can't, you pass it on. Then he handed the kid a flashlight, and the two of them went down into the engine bay because the alternator belt was squealing again and somebody had to learn how to set the tension. $6. That's what 20 men under a string of bare bulbs decided that boat was worth. They did the math out loud and came up with a number smaller than lunch. They weren't wrong about the condition. They were wrong about what condition means. Some things aren't worthless. They're just waiting on somebody willing to rebuild them. She has stayed with you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And subscribe, because there's a new story here almost every day. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.